Welcome to this story, one of the most unsettling cases ever noted in Missouri. Before we dive in, share in the comments where you're tuning in from and the exact time you started listening. It's always interesting to see the different places and hours of the day or night where these stories reach. In the winter of 1830, Clay County, Missouri, was still a raw stretch of frontier land. Rolling fields divided by streams, cabins built from green oak, and a silence that seemed to thicken after dusk. There were no railroads yet, only horse paths beaten through the frost. Few travelers passed without reason, and even fewer lingered where the soil looked newly turned. The story begins near a settlement known then as Mill Creek Hollow, about 15 miles south of Liberty. Records from the county office list a parcel purchased by one Elias Harker, aged 41, and his wife Margaret in the spring of that year. Along with them came 3 sons and a daughter, no one older than 17. Neighbors would later describe them as polite but withdrawn, preferring their own company and seldom attending gatherings at the chapel or market. At first, their homestead seemed ordinary. A 2-room cabin, smoke from a modest hearth, a garden fenced against deer. But as months passed, travelers complained of odd disturbances along the hollow road. Dogs barking deep into the night, the echo of an axe long after sunset, and a faint burning smell that clung to the wind. It was around that same year that tensions were rising throughout Missouri, leading eventually to incidents like the Hans Mill massacre, when fear and retribution blurred the line between justice and vengeance. Many later wondered if those same violent undercurrents had already been stirring in places like Mill Creek Hollow, long before the headlines. A traveling cobbler named Jonas Bell left behind a note in his ledger deed, dated October 1830, stopped at Harker's place by nightfall. Strange quiet. Girl at window did not speak, slept in shed, horses uneasy. It's the earliest known first-hand account connecting the Harker family to unease in the area. By spring of the following year, rumors began to grow darker. A cattle drover vanished near the creek, his wagon later found overturned and emptied of goods. A second disappearance, this time a boy of 12 sent to deliver grain, deepened local suspicion. But when the sheriff's deputies rode out to question Elias, they found the family gone about their chores, calm and composed, as though nothing had occurred. Still, townsfolk whispered. Some said the Harkers were burying strangers beneath their field. Others swore they saw smoke rising at odd hours, too thick and black for wood alone. The local minister, Reverend Stokes, wrote in his diary, "There is something unnatural in that house. They pray with no hymn, and their children watch from shadows." What began as murmurs soon became avoidance. No one traded with the family, and few dared cross their land. The hollow, once a path between farms, grew over with weeds and silence. Yet the story didn't vanish. It only sank deeper. By the summer of 1831, Mill Creek Hollow had grown unnaturally still. A single trail of wagon ruts led into the Harker property and disappeared behind a slope of brushwood and tall grass. Sheriff's deputies, led by Marshal Whitford, noted in their patrol logs that no smoke rises now from the chimney, yet the well is kept clean and the gate unbarred. It was as if the family wanted to appear occupied, while giving no sign of life. A farmer named Thomas Redd, who lived 2 miles north, told investigators that he once saw Elias's eldest son dragging something heavy wrapped in burlap toward the creek. "Could have been a deer," Redd later admitted under oath, "but I never heard no shot, and the creek ran red for a spell after." The fear was not unfounded. In that same region, the decade was marked by unrest. Communities like those mentioned in later accounts of Hans Mill suffered their own share of lawlessness, Yet what happened in the hollow bore none of the banners of war or religious feuds. It was private, silent, personal. Neighbors began recording their own small testimonies. A Mrs. Calloway, who gathered herbs near the ridge, said she found a line of crude wooden stakes half buried in the soil, each marked with a single carved cross. No one knew who placed them. When she returned weeks later, they were gone. A letter preserved in the Liberty Gazette archives, written by schoolteacher Samuel Deere, provides another fragment. The Harkers came to town for salt and iron nails. Their eyes seemed dull, like folks who'd been sleepless for weeks. The girl, Anna, clutched her father's coat and stared at the ground. I thought she whispered something, but I couldn't make it out. When I turned, they had vanished down the road. Sometime that autumn, the hollow caught attention again when a trader from St. Charles, Merritt Doyle, disappeared while delivering goods upriver. His cart was later found half buried near the Harker fence line. Inside were only tools and a torn scrap of ledger paper reading, "Stopped here. Night coming on." Marshal Whitford led a formal inquiry, though records note it was brief and inconclusive. He reported no signs of foul play, only the unease of neighbors and rumors unfit for formal notice. Within weeks, the case was closed. But the fear spread faster than facts. Some locals claimed the Harkers practiced rituals at the creek, drawings on the stones, animal bones arranged in circles. Others said the family's livestock were never seen grazing, though their smokehouse remained full. When the town elders convened in December 1831, they agreed privately that something wicked or unnatural lived at Mill Creek Hollow. Still, no one dared act. The frontier was thinly policed, and winter made travel perilous. Yet something did stir that season. A passing preacher, Reverend Jonas Elwell, recorded in his travel diary, "Stopped near Mill Creek Hollow this week. The air there is heavy. No birds, no laughter. A small child's shoe lay in the mud by the road. I took it as an omen." By year's end, the hollow had become a place folks only mentioned in lowered voices, a gap in the map where both memory and mercy grew cold. The year 1832 opened with a thaw that revealed more than the frozen earth. As the snows melted, hunters from Liberty reported finding scattered bones near the edge of Mill Creek Hollow. At first they assumed they were animal remains, until one noticed a fragment of fabric clinging to a rib cage. The cloth bore a faint pattern of blue stripes, the kind used for traders' shirts sold upriver. When word reached the sheriff's office, a deputy was dispatched, though his notes were brief. Visited the hollow, ground too soft for digging. The Harker family denies all knowledge. Father calm, mother unwell, children silent. Those same notes, preserved in county records, mention something curious, a ledger book with missing pages. The deputy claimed to have seen Elias writing in it, but when he asked to inspect it, the patriarch closed it and said softly, "Some things ain't meant for every man's eyes." The nearby settlement grew uneasy once more. The local paper ran a cautious line about disturbances near the hollow, omitting names. Still, everyone knew. Doors were barred earlier, and no one walked the creek road after sundown. That spring, a new element entered the story. A doctor named Abner Klein, a widower who had recently set up practice in Liberty. He was said to have visited the Harkers after hearing that Margaret, the mother, had taken ill. Klein later confided to a fellow physician that he'd found her pale, trembling, and seemingly terrified of her own kin. He claimed that during his brief stay, he heard someone digging behind the cabin long after midnight. Dr. Klein would later write in his journal, fragments of which survive in the county archives. No family I've seen carries such dread in their silence. The father watches every word, the children do not smile. I suspect more illness of the spirit than of the body. Around this same time, the tensions that would one day erupt into the Haun's Mill massacre were beginning to darken the air across Missouri. The sense of fear, mistrust, and justice, warped by distance, all of it found a smaller echo in Mill Creek Hollow, where law felt too far away and the truth seemed buried under its own weight. In May of 1832, another body surfaced downstream, a man of medium build, no head, no papers. Locals buried him near the riverbank, marking the grave only with a rock. No one came to claim him, but that summer the Harkers built a new smokehouse. When questioned, Elias said it was to keep the damp off the meat. Yet, as one neighbor noted in a deposition decades later, there was never any smell of hickory or ham, only earth and something sour. The hollow began to empty. Families moved closer to town. Even hunters avoided the ridge. In the church ledger for that year, Reverend Stokes wrote, "Attendance fair, spirits low. The Harkers have not appeared since autumn last. God preserve them, or else deliver us from their shadow." What happened next would finally force the town to act, but not in time to save everyone who went looking for answers. The spring of 1833 arrived with heavy rain and a flood that washed through Clay County. The swollen creek tore at the banks near Mill Creek Hollow, revealing a half-collapsed section of the Harkers' lower field. It was there that two boys, fishing with homemade lines, stumbled upon something that changed the town's silence into terror. What they saw, according to later affidavits, were bones of more than one man, tangled as if thrown together in haste. Sheriff Whitford's replacement, Deputy Marshal Ezra Klein, was sent to investigate. His report, dated April 18, 1833, stated, "The remains were indeed human, partial and recent, found in shallow graves covered with stones, no possessions. The Harker family denies knowledge, claiming washout from old Indian burials." But it was clear to everyone, these were not ancient remains. The cut marks on the bones were too sharp, the clothing remnants too new. When Klein returned to question Elias again, the man refused him entry. Witnesses later recalled hearing shouts inside the cabin, followed by a single gunshot. The lawman left the scene unharmed, but a note in his ledger reads, "Cannot shake the feeling the shot was meant to silence, not to warn." The next week, Margaret Harker appeared in town, barefoot, clutching a basket of spoiled vegetables. She spoke to no one, wandered through the market in a daze, and was last seen walking north toward the cemetery. That night, rain fell again, and she was gone by morning. Rumors spread that she'd drowned herself in the creek, though no body was ever found. Some claimed Elias forbade any search of their land, while others whispered that he'd already buried her in secret. Meanwhile, strange lights began to appear on the ridge, lanterns or something like them, moving in circles long after midnight. A traveler passing through Liberty wrote in his diary, "Saw fires dancing above. A dark field. Thought it to be men searching for lost cattle, but no voices, no shouts, only the wind and what sounded like iron scraping." By midsummer, the townsfolk demanded intervention. Marshal Klein organized a small posse of 6 men to ride out and confront the Harkers directly. They left at dawn on July 2nd and returned 2 days later, without Elias or his children. Their accounts differ. One man, Robert Finch, swore the cabin was empty, though the hearth was warm and bread still soft. Another, Caleb Morse, said he saw a figure fleeing through the woods, barefoot and carrying a shovel. The posse searched for 3 more days, finding only traces, an overturned chair, a child's drawing on the wall, and a half-buried crate of bones near the well. The discovery forced the county to act officially, at last. Notices were printed, warnings issued, and the hollow was declared off-limits pending further investigation. But the records show no arrests, no trials, and no graves marked with the Harker name. Over time, the family seemed to dissolve into rumor. Sightings of them in neighboring counties, reports of abandoned camps, and once a claim from a trader in Independence that a man matching Elias's description offered to sell him iron fittings and teeth. By the end of 1833, Mill Creek Hollow had become a ghost in the census. Land unclaimed, property deserted, and silence stretching over it once again. When winter set in again, the abandoned Harker homestead began to rot back into the earth. Travelers who braved the hollow described the roof sagging under snow, windows dark as sockets, the door swinging loose in the wind. It was said that anyone who lingered near the cabin after dusk could hear the creak of floorboards and the faint sound of someone pacing within. In January of 1834, Deputy Marshal Klein returned to the site with a court order allowing a full search. He brought with him 2 laborers, a cart, and Reverend Stokes as a witness. What they found over the next 2 days filled 14 pages of notes, many of which are now lost, but portions survive in the county's unclassified Casebook B. The cellar, they recorded, was deeper than expected, 3 steps below the main floor and lined with rough limestone. Near the back wall, the men uncovered a buried compartment sealed with pitch. Inside were fragments of bone, several rusted tools, and what Klein described as a ledger of debts with names not known to any merchant in Liberty. The handwriting alternated, sometimes Elias's, sometimes a shakier hand, perhaps that of his eldest son. Reverend Stokes later told the Liberty Gazette, "The smell of that place was not of the dead, but of despair." I prayed aloud, but it felt as though the air itself refused to carry the words. Among the items listed in the report were several small brass buttons, a silver watch inscribed with the initials J.B., and a lock of hair tied in ribbon. The initials matched those of Jonas Bell, the traveling cobbler whose note had once been dismissed as trivial. The watch was sent to Liberty for identification, and the coroner wrote that it confirmed suspicions long held by the townsfolk. The county convened an inquest in early March 1834. Testimonies were gathered from nearby farmers, including the Callaways, who admitted to hearing cries at night, but feared to interfere. Dr. Abner Klein testified that Mrs. Harker had been not of sound mind, and that he believed the father's cruelty or delusion extended to all within that house. Yet, without bodies or living suspects, the case remained open but unresolved. A formal warrant for Elias Harker and his surviving children was issued, though it was never served. By mid-year, reports emerged of a small family matching their description seen near the Osage River, trading pelts and moving south. No lawman pursued them beyond Boone County. As 1835 dawned, Missouri was changing. Settlements grew, new roads were planned, and the old frontier was receding. But the hollow stayed untouched. The property records listed as abandoned for moral cause, a phrase used nowhere else in the county's history. Some years later, a teacher gathering firewood near the ruins wrote in a letter, "The soil there feels different, soft and heavy, as if it breathes when you walk upon it. The birds keep to the tree line, and even the wind grows quiet. I do not linger long." For a while it seemed the Harker name would fade like smoke, until a discovery almost 20 years later brought the legend roaring back into Missouri's troubled memory. In the summer of 1853, nearly 2 decades after the Harker family had vanished, Clay County was no longer a frontier but a settled part of the young state. The railroad was rumored to be coming through within the decade, and talk of progress filled the taverns. Yet one parcel of land, still marked abandoned for moral cause, remained untouched, the hollow. It was during the survey for a new wagon road that the Harker land was disturbed again. A crew under Foreman Luther Pike began clearing brush near the old foundation. One of the men, digging for a post hole, struck wood that sounded hollow. They uncovered a small chest, water-damaged, but still sealed by iron bands. Inside were several items wrapped in oilcloth, a rusted knife, a handful of tarnished coins, and a folded sheet of paper covered in faded ink. The words were still legible. "We did not mean to kill him. It was his eyes. They never stopped looking." The men brought the chest to town, where it was placed in the sheriff's office for review. Sheriff Orrin Haskell, who had replaced the long-retired Marshal Klein, reopened the Harker file. Over the next months, he compiled old testimonies, church ledgers, and depositions from surviving witnesses. What emerged was a chilling timeline. At least 9 disappearances within a 5-mile radius between 1830 and 1833, all last seen near Mill Creek Hollow. Haskell's investigation reached Jefferson City, where state officials debated whether to pursue what was now an ancient and unprosecutable case. The official response, dated September 1853, reads simply, "Matter too distant to warrant expense or action." But the sheriff continued his inquiry privately. He interviewed Reverend Stokes, now an old man nearly blind, who still recalled the night he prayed at the Harker homestead. "There were voices in the ground," he told Haskell. "You could feel them more than hear the—" Haskell also visited Dr. Abner Klein's son, who had inherited his father's journals. Among them was a page referencing the family. "She feared her husband would bury her alive for knowing too much. I advised her to leave, but she said he already kept watch over her dreams." This detail reignited speculation that Margaret Harker's disappearance had been more than despair. It was likely murder. Around that same time, scholars in Missouri were beginning to record oral histories and local legends. One such account, preserved in the Missouri Historical Society, mentions the hollow by name, a cursed ground where a family of settlers vanished, leaving behind a house that hums at night. Coincidentally, that same decade saw renewed research into frontier violence, with references to events like the Haun's Mill massacre, reminding readers that Missouri's past was steeped in both personal and communal bloodshed. The Harker story, though smaller in scale, fit uneasily within that broader shadow, violence born not of politics, but of the home. By autumn, curiosity seekers began to visit the hollow again. Some brought shovels, others notebooks. One local reporter described the faint outline of cellar stones, moss-covered and cold, like teeth. None stayed past nightfall. And as the sheriff's office prepared to close the renewed file, a final discovery halted the ink in his pen. The final discovery came unexpectedly in November of 1853. Heavy rains had again eroded the lower banks of Mill Creek, and a farmer named Jedediah Moore, riding past the hollow at dusk, noticed a piece of wood jutting from the soil, weathered, blackened, and carved with faint lettering. When he pulled it free, he found it was a portion of a signboard that once read Harker Sons, Timber Goods. Beneath the post was a cavity filled with soft mud and what looked like fragments of bone. Sheriff Haskell returned to the scene the next morning with a coroner and 2 laborers. As they cleared the earth, they unearthed a full skeleton, its wrists bound with wire, and a second, smaller set of remains positioned beside it, likely a child. Both were too decomposed for identification, but near them lay a buckle engraved with the initials A.H. It was speculated quietly that these were the remains of Anna Harker, the daughter, and her father, Elias himself. The condition of the bones suggested they had lain there for 20 years or more. The coroner noted blunt force trauma to the man's skull, writing, "Death by crushing instrument, possibly spade or mallet." If true, it meant someone had turned on Elias, perhaps from within his own family, but the question remained, Who buried them, and where were the rest? The discovery reignited public fascination. The Liberty Gazette ran the headline, "Graves Unearthed in the Hollow, Echo of an Old Terror." Locals whispered that the family had destroyed itself, consumed by whatever evil they had practiced. One farmer claimed that when the bones were removed, a sour mist rose from the ground, making men dizzy. Sheriff Haskell ordered the remains reburied in consecrated soil, though Reverend Stokes objected. "The ground won't take them," he said. "It knows their sin." The bodies were finally laid in the far corner of the Liberty Cemetery, marked. Following the burial, strange reports resumed almost immediately. Travelers claimed to see a woman in gray standing by the creek, holding a lantern that gave no light. Children dared each other to walk the ridge after dark and returned pale, speaking of a whispering under the grass. A local historian, Professor William Treadway of St. Louis, visited in 1854 to document the case. His field notes, housed today in the Missouri Historical Archive, include sketches of the hollow and transcriptions of witness accounts. He wrote, "What fascinates me most is not what remains, but what was erased, records missing, names blotted out. It is as though the land itself conspired to hide the truth." Treadway compared the case to other episodes of frontier violence, referencing again the period surrounding Haun's Mill, suggesting that when law is far, conscience decays. By the close of 1854, the hollow was fenced off, officially declared unfit for cultivation. But still, hunters reported unease in its woods. Some said they found animal carcasses arranged in deliberate patterns. Others claimed to hear faint tapping beneath the soil, like someone searching for a way out. Even now, the sheriff's last note on the file remains hauntingly simple: "Closed for lack of the living." By 1855, Mill Creek Hollow had fallen back into quiet. Its name carried more as a warning than a place. The nearby farms prospered again, but none extended their fences toward the old Harker property. The road survey that had once passed close by was redirected 2 miles west, with no official explanation. It was said that mules balked and refused to cross the ridge, forcing crews to reroute entirely. Still, curiosity had a way of finding its path. That spring, Professor William Treadway, the St. Louis historian who had first recorded the site, returned accompanied by 2 assistants and a sketch artist. His goal, as he wrote in his travel diary, was to reconcile folklore with record. He camped at the edge of the hollow for 3 nights. The professor's notes from that visit survive in fragments. Ink faded, paper brittle. One passage reads, "On the second evening, near 10 o'clock, we heard a rhythmic thudding from beneath the ridge, steady as a pulse. I presumed it to be shifting stones from the thaw, but it ceased abruptly when I approached. The ground there is softer than elsewhere, and the air seems to hum faintly, though the trees stand still." His assistant, Caleb Rhodes, corroborated the account in his own handwriting, though he added a troubling detail. "The sound was not the earth, but something hollow, perhaps a cavity beneath the field. I felt heat rising through the soil." When they returned to St. Louis, Treadway published a small article in the Frontier Review Quarterly, describing Mill Creek Hollow as a rare confluence of isolation, violence, and superstition. He avoided naming the Harkers directly, instead calling them a frontier family undone by secrecy. The article was widely read, and soon the hollow attracted amateur seekers and spiritualists. In the growing age of seances and mesmerism, the idea of a haunted field drew both skeptics and morbidly curious. A few made sketches or claimed to hear voices. One woman wrote that she dreamed of a girl with mud on her hands whispering, "Help him up." Local authorities, irritated by the attention, posted signs forbidding trespass, but the legend had already taken root. Even school children knew verses derived from the tale. Don't go down to Mill Creek's turn, the Harkers wait, their lanterns burn. In 1858, a lightning storm struck the last standing structure, the collapsed Harker cabin. Witnesses in Liberty saw the glow from miles away. When the storm cleared, the hollow smoldered, and all trace of the building was gone. Some said it was divine providence, others retribution. Yet the next morning, when the sheriff inspected the site, he found something in the ash, a single iron key, ornate and unlike the crude locks common to frontier homes. Its teeth were bent, as if twisted by force. No lock was ever found to fit it. By decade's end, the legend of the Harker family had become a Missouri ghost story, told in hushed tones beside firelight. But among archivists and historians, the unease persisted. How had so many people vanished, and why did the records surrounding them remain so perfectly incomplete? It would be years before anyone would dare to dig again. By the early 1860s, America itself was coming apart. The Civil War had broken across the nation, and Missouri, caught between loyalties, became a land of divided homes and hidden feuds. For most, Mill Creek Hollow was only a legend now, a local warning told to keep travelers from wandering too far. Yet, in that turmoil, history has a way of resurfacing. During the war, Union scouts passed through Clay County, mapping back roads and homesteads for supply routes. One of them, Corporal Edwin Luttrell, kept a field journal later found among his effects after his death in 1864. His entry from October 1862 reads, "Came across a valley the locals call the Hollow. The ground soft and pocked like it's been dug over many times. Found an old marker stone. Letter H faintly cut. Camped nearby, but horses spooked all night. Men said they heard someone walking behind the tent, though I saw no tracks come morning." Luttrell's account might have been dismissed as wartime nerves, but a second entry deepened the mystery. Private Anders found an old well, sealed with boards and stones. Said he heard water beneath. When we pried the cover loose, the air that came out smelled of iron and rot. We closed it fast and rode on. After the war, the field journal was filed with other military records in Jefferson City, where it caught the attention of none other than Professor Treadway, now elderly and frail. He wrote a final letter to the Missouri Historical Society, noting that Luttrell's coordinates placed the soldiers within a few hundred yards of the old Harker property. "If that well still exists," he wrote, "it may contain what the earth has refused to forget." In 1866, a brief but ambitious attempt was made to excavate the area. County workers, tasked with reclaiming abandoned land, uncovered several artifacts: a corroded tin cup, a bone-handled knife, and, most disturbingly, a length of chaw, embedded in the soil, leading nowhere. The foreman halted the work after his men refused to continue. Officially, the report cites unstable terrain. Around this time, the Haun's Mill massacre began to reappear in Missouri's collective memory, as historians drew parallels between isolated violence and the unchecked brutality of frontier justice. The Hollow was mentioned again in print, this time as an example of how ordinary settlers could vanish from record, their crimes and fates swallowed by the land itself. Yet the Hollow never yielded its secrets. Travelers who ventured too near claimed that compasses spun wildly, and animals refused to cross the creek. One passing preacher wrote to his wife, "It is a lovely valley until you listen. Then you realize it is never truly silent. There is always something breathing beneath." By 1868, new settlers purchased land around the area, fencing it off entirely. They built their homes miles from the center and never tilled the soil within its bounds. On local maps, it was labeled simply old Harker place, unfit. And though decades had passed since the family's disappearance, each time rain fell heavy and long. The water that flowed down from the ridge carried with it a faint red hue, staining the creek bed for days. The elders said the land was remembering. By the dawn of the 1870s, Mill Creek Hollow was surrounded by new farms and orchards, but the heart of the valley remained untouched. Locals called it the Gap, an empty tract no one claimed, though its soil was dark and fertile. The Harker homestead had long since vanished, yet the hollow's reputation lived on, in sermons, in tavern talk, and in the lingering hesitation of any who rode too close after sunset. In 1871, the Clay County Historical Board began cataloging early settler records. Among the boxes of brittle deeds and birth ledgers, a clerk named Nathaniel Crow discovered a misfiled envelope labeled only 1833, Property Ledger, Mill Creek. Inside were 4 folded sheets covered in uneven handwriting, apparently copied from an original that no longer existed. The content was mundane: supply tallies, livestock counts, until the final line, written in darker ink: paid in full, 3 heads, no witnesses. The entry was unsigned, but the handwriting matched older tax receipts from Elias Harker. Crow's superior, alarmed, sent the documents to Jefferson City for verification, where they were quietly archived without public comment. The surviving note remains referenced only in footnotes under Disputed Accounts, Clay County, 1830-1840. Later that same year, a small group of railway workers reported strange interference when laying a telegraph line near the hollow. The instruments failed repeatedly, producing static that sounded like whispering voices, according to foreman Isaac Drury. When the line was redirected, the interference ceased. Drury remarked in his letter to the telegraph company, "It's as if the earth there hums at its own frequency." Around this period, old residents began dying off, taking their memories with them. But their children kept the stories alive, of cries in the wind, of lights moving where no house stood, of the field that grew no thing, though no one ever plowed it. A newspaper from 1873 mentions the cursed hollow of Liberty County, noting how cattle refuse to graze there and how farmhands swear to hearing hymns sung low in a woman's voice. Professor Treadway, who had been the earliest to study the case, passed away that same year. In his effects, found by his nephew, was a sketch labeled "Structure Below Harker Cabin, Probable Cellar Design." It depicted not a square, but a circle, with an arrow pointing downward and a note beside it. Too precise for simple storage. It was also during this decade that Missouri saw an increase in archaeological societies cataloging indigenous sites. One such group visited the hollow in 1875, expecting to find burial mounds or artifacts. Instead, their notes mention disturbed terrain of human making, recent by comparison. They left after only 1 day. In a brief reflection published the following year, one of them wrote, "Some places in this state seem to drink time itself. You can dig for history, but the ground only gives you stories." And so the hollow remained undisturbed, neither wholly forgotten nor fully remembered, existing in that uneasy place between fact and legend. But by 1878, a new generation would once again bring shovels and questions into its soil, and not all of them would return. In 1878, Missouri was changing fast. New towns, schools, and rail lines promised a modern age. But curiosity about the old frontier never faded, and for a group of young men from Liberty College, Mill Creek Hollow was the perfect place to test courage and skepticism. That spring, 5 students, Charles Marin, John Platt, Edward Loomis, and brothers Samuel and Thomas Gray, organized a weekend expedition to the hollow. Their plan was simple: camp overnight, record any strange occurrences, and disprove the old stories. Marin kept a detailed journal which survives today in the college archive. His first entry reads, April 10th, 1878, weather mild. Arrived at Mill Creek Hollow by horse. Found the ground damp from recent rain. Strange quiet. Even the frogs silent. Camped near the old well, stones still sealed, as described by Professor Treadway years ago. The first night passed without incident, though Platt remarked that the wind sounded like voices moving in and out of the trees. On the second day, they began to dig near the foundation stones of the old cabin, hoping to find relics. After 2 feet, they struck something hard, a rusted hinge and fragments of charred wood. Then, according to Merrin's journal, the shovel hit a cavity. When they cleared the dirt away, they found an opening barely wide enough for a man's shoulders. The air that came out was cold and smelled faintly metallic. Samuel Gray insisted they stop, but Loomis, the most daring, lowered a lantern into the space. The light showed a chamber no more than 6 feet wide, Merrin wrote. The walls were cut earth. There was a shape in the corner. Could have been a beam, could have been something else. The lantern flickered, then went out. They pulled Loomis up, but he didn't speak for several minutes. When he did, his voice was thin. There's writing down there, on the wall, not in English. They left, the hollow before nightfall, shaken. Merrin's final entry reads, No sound but wind. Yet I could swear someone called my name from under the hill. I shall not return. 2 weeks later, Edward Loomis was found dead in his boarding room. No signs of violence, but his hands were stained dark as if with soil. The coroner attributed it to natural causes. Still, word spread, and the Hollow's legend deepened. By autumn, the college sealed Merrin's journal and the retrieved hinge in a cabinet labeled Unverified Accounts. For years, faculty discouraged students from revisiting the site, though some quietly did. Meanwhile, Missouri's newspapers turned their attention to other matters: economic unrest, the lingering echoes of the Civil War. The Harker story faded from print, but remained in whispers. Those who farmed within a mile of the hollow swore the ground there breathed like a sleeping thing during summer storms. The last recorded sighting from this decade came from a woodcutter named Hiram Tull, who claimed he saw a girl with long hair walking the ridge, carrying a lantern that shone blue. He followed her tracks halfway down the slope, but they stopped suddenly, as though she had stepped off the earth itself. The hollow was fenced off again the next year. The sign read, Private land, no trespass without permit. But everyone in Liberty knew no permit would ever be issued. By 1881, Mill Creek Hollow had taken on the weight of legend, a name spoken with a kind of uneasy reverence, especially by those whose families had lived in Clay County for generations. The land remained unclaimed and unworked, though taxes were occasionally paid by an anonymous party through an intermediary at the county clerk's office. The receipts bore no name, only the mark of a simple cross. That year, a drought swept through the region, cracking the ground and lowering the water level in the creek. When the bed dried enough to walk across, children from nearby farms discovered the outline of something metallic beneath the silt, a circular ring about the width of a wagon wheel, embedded deep in the mud. Adults assumed it was debris from an old bridge or cart and told them to leave it be. But, as one farmer noted, that ring didn't rust. It looked as if it had been put there yesterday. Weeks later, an itinerant photographer, Mr. Lucian Ward, traveling the back roads of Missouri to document pioneer relics, took an interest in the hollow. He persuaded a local guide, Mary Calloway, granddaughter of the woman who once found wooden stakes there, to accompany him. Her journal entry from that day reads, The place is colder than I imagined, though the sun was high. The air hums faintly in the ears. He took his photograph, and I swear the image glass turned dark before the exposure was finished. When Ward developed the plate in Liberty, the result caused a quiet stir. The photograph, still kept in the Clay County Archive, shows the landscape exactly as described. Bare trees, the low ridge, the creek. But in the corner of the frame stands a faint silhouette, small and indistinct, appearing to face the camera. Ward dismissed it as a trick of shadow, yet he never took another photograph in the area. Around the same time, Dr. Malcolm Vire, a physician and amateur historian, revisited old case notes on the Harker disappearances. He corresponded with the Missouri Historical Society, referencing events like the Haun's Mill Massacre to contextualize the violence of that era. In one letter he wrote, "I do not believe the Harkers were devils nor saints. They were people shaped by fear, isolation, and something older, something that turns the soil itself against the living." Dr. Vire's research culminated in a short treatise titled Unquiet Ground, Notes on the Harker Legacy, privately printed in 1883. Only 50 copies were distributed, mostly to academics. He concluded that the hollow was a monument, not of crime, but of concealment. In late 1884, storms once again struck Clay County. Floodwaters tore through Mill Creek Hollow, eroding the ridge where the Harker cabin had once stood. Locals reported seeing strange lights in the downpour, a dozen lanterns swaying like mourners, as one farmer described it. The next morning, when the rain had passed, the earth along the creek had collapsed. Beneath the mud, faint outlines of wooden supports, perhaps from a buried cellar, were visible before the water swallowed them again. The sheriff's office noted the incident as land subsidence, but the record ends with an odd remark. Residents advise avoiding area for reasons not solely of safety. And with that, the hollow returned to silence, its soil once again sealed, as if determined to keep its story incomplete. By 1886, the hollow had become a name more than a place, spoken in folklore, written about in pamphlets, and whispered in old houses during long winters. Few alive then had any memory of the original Harker family, yet their shadow lingered like an old stain that refused to fade. That summer, the Missouri Rural Chronicle published a serialized article titled The Lost Family of Mill Creek, loosely based on Dr. Vire's treatise. It presented the Harkers as both victims and villains, a frontier family driven mad by isolation, whose crimes blurred into myth. The article revived public curiosity, and for the first time in decades, travelers began venturing near the site again. Among them was Mrs. Lydia Purcell, a school teacher from Independence known for collecting regional ghost tales. In her own handwritten account, preserved in the Independence Historical Archive, she described visiting the hollow in early September. The air there moves strangely, like breath drawn and released from the ground itself. I felt dizzy though the day was cool. At one point, my parasol slipped and fell, and when I stooped to retrieve it, I saw a small indentation in the soil, round and smooth, as if pressed by a child's bare foot. She collected a handful of earth, sealed it in a jar, and brought it home as a curiosity. Within weeks, she wrote to a colleague complaining of persistent headaches and a faint knocking sound from her study wall at night. Her health declined rapidly thereafter. The jar, according to the school's records, was buried in the garden behind the library. Meanwhile, the Chronicle received letters from readers claiming descent from the Harker line. One correspondent from Arkansas, identifying himself only as E.H. Jr., asserted that his grandfather escaped the hollow and built a new life under another name. The letter contained no verifiable details, but the hand. Writing matched samples from the original county records, an unsettling link, though never confirmed. By this time, historians had begun to draw broader parallels between the Harker mystery and Missouri's turbulent early years. How the same land that saw the Hans Mill massacre could also birth a quieter, more private violence. Every field holds a confession, one historian wrote in 1887. The difference is only whether someone hears it. That same year, an itinerant preacher named Reverend Abram Fielding was traveling through Clay County when he stopped near the hollow to rest his horse. His testimony, recorded later in a church gazette, offers a haunting note. The place seemed still until I prayed aloud. Then came a sound like pebbles striking tin, soft but many. The air turned cold, and I heard, clear as my own voice, someone whisper, "Amen." He left that night without finishing his prayer. By the century's end, Mill Creek Hollow had become more myth than memory. Yet every few years, something, an uncovered bone, a washed-out plank, a journal rediscovered, would draw its name back into daylight. It was as though the hollow refused to remain buried, reminding each generation that it still held its secrets. But in 1890, one final attempt to reclaim the land would bring the legend full circle and nearly erase it altogether. In 1890, Clay County sought to modernize its old properties, clearing titles and reselling long-abandoned lands to encourage new settlement. Among those parcels was the infamous Harker tract, still listed as abandoned for moral cause, a phrase that puzzled the younger clerks, but chilled the older ones who remembered why. The contract for reclamation fell to Mr. Reuben Doss, a pragmatic land broker from St. Joseph known for his efficiency. To him, Mill Creek Hollow was merely acreage gone to waste. He planned to drain it, clear it, and sell it for pasture within the year. When neighbors warned him, he laughed. There's no curse that hard work can't break. By early spring, crews began cutting a drainage trench along the creek. The men worked quickly until they reached the ridge where the Harker cabin once stood. There, tools broke unexpectedly, horses refused to advance, and one laborer claimed his hands blistered the moment he touched the soil. Doss dismissed it as superstition and pressed them on. On April 19, 1890, while digging near the center of the field, the crew struck what they thought was rock. But as they cleared around it, they found timber, old beams arranged in a circle with a hollow beneath. Beneath that hollow was air and something else, the faint scent of smoke and metal. Foreman Jesse Vaughn descended first, lantern in hand. His statement to the county later read, "It weren't a cellar like no storage I seen. It was round, smooth, and the walls looked cut, not dug. At the bottom, I found bits of iron and bone mixed together like they'd melted and cooled. Then my light went out." When Vaughn was pulled back up, he was pale and trembling. He swore the darkness below had a shape, like a man kneeling, only larger. The other workers refused to continue. Doss threatened dismissal, but not a single man would descend again. By noon, the site was deserted. That evening, Doss himself returned alone. Locals saw his lantern moving across the ridge at sundown. It burned for several hours, then vanished. When the sheriff arrived at dawn, there was no sign of him except his hat resting on the lip of the opened pit. The trench collapsed later that day, burying whatever lay below. County officials recorded the event as industrial misadventure, and the property title was sealed once more. For years afterward, whenever storms flooded the valley, neighbors said they saw a faint glow where the earth had caved in, like embers breathing beneath the water. By the following winter, the hollow was declared permanently closed to habitation. Even the survey maps of Clay County were redrawn to omit it entirely, leaving only a blank space between two property lines. Reverend Fielding, now elderly, wrote in his last sermon, "There are places God leaves empty so that men may remember what silence means." The hollow fell back into obscurity, and the Harker name drifted like smoke across the generations, sometimes whispered, sometimes forgotten, but never entirely gone. By 1893, only a handful of locals even remembered where Mill Creek Hollow had once lain. The new rail line passed several miles to the east, and the surrounding land was parceled off under different names. On paper, the hollow ceased to exist. Yet in the minds of those who lived near the old ridge, it lingered like a splinter under the skin, unseen, but never unfelt. That year, a traveling journalist named Elias Wren, writing for the St. Louis Observer, embarked on a series titled Forgotten Corners of Missouri. He had heard of the hollow from a tavern keeper in Liberty who warned him, "If you find it, you won't want to." Intrigued, Wren followed old deeds and church maps until he located the overgrown path leading into the valley. His surviving notebook, recovered decades later, provides a rare description of what the place had become. There is no sound here, no birds, no wind through the trees. The ground looks unsteady, as if recently disturbed, though it has not been touched in years. The air feels colder, almost damp. I saw where the creek bends, its color the faint brown of rust, though no iron runs nearby. Wren spent 2 nights camped near the old creek bed. The first passed uneventfully, but on the second he wrote, "A faint tapping woke me, steady and deliberate, like knuckles on wood. It came from beneath me. When I moved my lantern, it stopped. But just before dawn, I heard whispering, 2 voices, one soft, one older, repeating a single word I could not make out." He returned to St. Louis soon after and published only a short column. Some places were never meant to be revisited. Mill Creek Hollow remains one such wound upon the land. 3 months later, Wren disappeared while traveling through western Missouri. His horse was found near Boonville, saddlebags intact, his notebook missing. The Observer printed a small obituary, calling his final notes, "Unfinished business." In Liberty, where the old records still rested in damp archives, Sheriff Haskell's notebook, once forgotten, was rediscovered by a new deputy cataloging historical evidence. Its final entry, dated 1854, was a single sentence underlined twice. "If they are buried, they are not buried deep enough." After Wren's disappearance, local farmers fenced off the area again, though few needed the reminder. When storms rolled over Clay County, they said thunder always paused over the hollow, as if the sky itself hesitated there. That same year, a preacher from Kansas City, Reverend Ellison Price, attempted to hold a small service at the ridge to lay lingering spirits to rest. Only 5 attended. His notes describe a stillness that deepened with every prayer, and then a gust of wind so strong it extinguished every lantern at once. The group fled before finishing the benediction. When asked later if he would return, Price replied simply, "The ground refused it." By the century's end, Mill Creek Hollow was absent from maps and memory alike, yet somehow its silence still traveled, carried in old stories, strange dreams, and the uneasy feeling that something beneath Missouri's soil was still awake. By 1898, the turn of the century loomed, and Missouri was embracing modernity. Telegraphs, railroads, and even the first electric lamps in Liberty Square. The world was moving forward, but the hollow remained a void on every new survey. No one claimed it, no one built near it, and yet the stories refused to die. That year, a young historian from Columbia University, Dr. Joseph Latham, began compiling oral histories of early Missouri settlements. He arrived in Clay County, hoping to document pioneer life, but was soon drawn into the older, darker tales whispered by residents. Several elderly townsfolk spoke of the family under the hill, and one woman, nearly 90, insisted she had once seen their lanterns moving like stars on the ground. Latham dismissed the claims at first, but when he was shown a fragment of a wooden beam unearthed by a farmer near the old creek, his skepticism began to falter. The wood was blackened and bore 3 letters carved crudely into its surface: E.H. He recorded the artifact in his field notes. Wood appears older than claimed, tool marks inconsistent with modern chisels, could date from early 1830s, provenance uncertain. Latham decided to visit the hollow himself. In a letter to his fiancée, he described the journey. The path is nearly gone. Grass grows high, but one feels watched. There is an odor, not decay, not earth, but something stale, metallic. I took a compass reading, but the needle turned slowly, as if tired. He spent only an hour there before dusk, but returned shaken. His last field note reads, "Something moves when one stands still. Heard whispering behind me, though no one near. Will not go again." Weeks later, Latham presented his findings at a historical society meeting in St. Louis. He spoke of the Harker family, of records gone missing, of the strange continuity between their story and broader events like the Haun's Mill Massacre, where fear and vengeance blurred into tragedy. His conclusion was both historical and haunting. In Missouri's early years, the frontier was not only a wilderness of land, but of conscience. The audience applauded politely, though some later remarked that he seemed unwell, his voice hoarse, his hands trembling. Within a year, Latham left academia and moved east, publishing no further work. His papers, found after his death in 1905, contained sketches of the hollow's topography, but no explanation for why he had returned there a second time, as several locals later claimed he did. One account, given by a farmer's son in 1902, stated simply, "A man came one evening with a lantern and a satchel, said he wanted to see the Harker field. He never came back, but the next morning the air smelled of smoke again." By century's end, the hollow was once more left to the elements, its soil slowly reclaiming every trace of those who had disturbed it. But the name persisted, murmured in small-town gatherings and regional lore, always ending with the same uneasy phrase. Some families build homes, others build graves. The new century brought new faith in reason. By 1900, superstition was mocked in Missouri's growing towns. Yet in rural corners, the hollow remained unspoken, a space left blank even on the most modern maps. Young people sometimes sought it out for bravado. Most came back laughing. A few did not return at all. In 1903, local newspapers reported the disappearance of Henry Folsom, a farm hand of 23. He'd told friends he planned to see the hollow for himself, after hearing ghost stories in a tavern. His horse was found 3 days later near the creek's edge, reins snapped, eyes wide in terror. Henry was never recovered. The investigation turned up little. Deputies found a depression in the soil shaped like a footprint, bare, narrow, child-sized, but no other tracks. The sheriff's report ended with a note nearly identical to one written 70 years before. Ground unstable. No further search recommended. That same year, a group of surveyors working for a new rail extension passed within a mile of the site. Their instruments recorded strange magnetic fluctuations, and one surveyor, George Edlin, described a low rumble underfoot, not like thunder, but breathing. His superior dismissed it as faulty equipment, though Edlin later refused to return to the area. In 1905, during a spell of heavy rain, the creek overflowed once again. Locals awoke to find small items washed downstream: buttons, a spoon, a child's comb, all blackened with age. Each bore initials faintly scratched into the metal: A.H. and E.H. The county coroner, though long removed from his predecessor's obsessions, noted the coincidence grimly. By now, the Hollow had become a magnet for spiritualists, who viewed it as a thin place, a point where the veil between life and death was weak. They held small gatherings at the ridge, lighting candles and chanting hymns. Witnesses later claimed that during one such séance, a woman fainted, murmuring words none recognized. Her husband swore she spoke in another voice entirely. In response, the county board posted signs once again: "No entry, unsafe land." It made no difference. Curiosity always found its way through the fence. Old-timers noticed something stranger still. Whenever someone disappeared near Mill Creek, rain followed within the week. It was said that the sky itself grieved, and the creek, swollen with memory, turned darker than before. By 1907, even the youngest residents of Liberty spoke of the Harkers as if they were a story told to frighten children. But those who walked the ridge at dusk, farmhands, mail riders, the occasional hunter, swore they heard faint noises carried on the wind, metal striking stone, slow and deliberate, like digging. One diary from that year, belonging to Clara Treadway, great niece of Professor William Treadway, captures the mood of that generation. "I don't believe in curses, but there are places that remember, and this one does. The Hollow is quiet, but it feels awake. I think it dreams of the people who once belonged to it." The Hollow was now less a location than an inheritance, passed from rumor to record, from witness to whisper, awaiting the next person who would dare to disturb its sleep. By 1910, the Hollow existed only in the margins of memory, mentioned in passing by historians, feared by locals, and absent from every new map. Fields had grown over its boundaries, and the once black soil was now hidden beneath weeds and wildflowers. Yet those who lived nearby swore the air there never changed. It carried a chill even in the height of summer. That spring, a small team from the newly formed Missouri Geological Survey passed through Clay County to study old riverbeds and fault lines. Among them was Dr. Edith Collier, one of the few women geologists of her day. She noted the persistent rumors of a valley of strange magnetism and convinced her colleagues to make a brief stop. Her report, filed in June 1910, contains the last official record of Mill Creek Hollow. The terrain shows abnormal mineral density. The soil, when disturbed, releases faint metallic vapor, possibly oxidation of buried iron. Compass bearings unreliable. No evidence of habitation for nearly a century. However, the sense of pressure, psychological or otherwise, is notable. Collier's team left before sunset. She later wrote privately to a colleague at Washington University. "There is something below that ground, not geological but deliberate. It feels arranged, as if designed to be forgotten." That letter was never published, but it survived among her papers after her death in 1921. As the years passed, the land was quietly reclassified as state-owned reserve. No development followed. Locals said machinery failed there, horses went lame, and even birds avoided nesting in the trees along the ridge. A few hikers in later decades claimed to find remnants of stone arranged in circles, impossibly symmetrical for natural erosion. When asked about the place, an old farmer named Thomas Fielding, grandson of Reverend Fielding, offered the simplest answer: "We leave it alone. It leaves us alone. That's the bargain." And so, Mill Creek Hollow faded from human touch, existing only in the records. Court notes smudged by time, half-burned journals, and the testimonies of those who swore the ground itself could breathe. Even now, more than a century later, when storms sweep through Clay County, the water that runs from the hills still carries a faint reddish hue. Some say it's iron from the soil. Others whisper, it's something older, something that remembers. The hollow never gave up its dead, nor its truth. And perhaps that's why the story endures, not as history, but as warning. For if you ever find yourself walking the back roads of Missouri, and you notice the trees grow sparse and the air turns still, stop where you are. Because past that silence lies a field that does not forget, and some doors once opened do not close again.